Hi guys, today's lesson is going to cover fat metabolism. Just a heads up that some of the information in this PowerPoint is not found in the book, so you want to make sure that you're taking notes along with the book, but also with this PowerPoint because, like I said, some of the notes you won't find in your book. So what I'd like to do is just show a quick review of the digestion of fats. So we eat triglycerides, they come from our food, and then they're broken down in the small intestines by bile and by lipases. So bile is going to emulsify the fats, break them down into smaller fat particles, and then the lipases will break them down into the fatty acids and glycerol. So I drew an intestinal wall here, so that's what this is supposed to represent, the villi. And so after the fatty acids and the glycerol are absorbed, the triglycerides reform, which is kind of interesting. So we have this reforming of triglycerides. So they're reforming after they're absorbed through the intestinal wall. And that kind of makes sense because if you remember, when we eat those triglycerides and we absorb them, that's when all those chylomicrons are coming out to kind of scavenge up the triglycerides and take them back to the liver or deposit them in fat cells or adipocytes. So it makes sense that they are going to reform after they're absorbed as fatty acids or as glycerol. Some of the glycerol will actually could be converted to pyruvate, and if you remember from carbohydrate metabolism, the pyruvate is something that ends up eventually going into the Krebs cycle. So some of that glycerol that breaks off of those triglycerides, it can be converted that way. So the triglycerides reform, and from there, the triglycerides are going to go either to the liver, being transported by the chylomicrons. They can make ATP, or they can synthesize lipoproteins or cholesterol, meaning they'll make more lipoproteins or they'll make cholesterol. The triglycerides can also be deposited in fat cells, or what we call adipocytes. Oops, that's not, there we go. Let's get that spelled right, adipocytes, like so. And when they're stored there, they're stored actually as really large fat droplets in the cytoplasm of those cells, and it actually makes up most of the cell. And so when the cell needs energy, it's going to pull from the triglycerides that were deposited there, release the fatty acids, which will then be oxidized, and ATP will be released. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the slideshow, but I wanted to kind of refresh your memory of what triglycerides break down to, and then what happens after they pass through the intestinal wall. So basically that's what I have on this slide. The note part of it, I sometimes like to do the flow charts just so you can kind of see things in a more organized fashion, and I can talk a little bit better about it. Okay, so let's move on to lipolysis. You can see I have drawn here a glycerol attached to 3 fatty acids. The Fa stands for fatty acids. And lipolysis is actually just the breaking apart of the fatty acids from the glycerol. So it's just that cleaving that happens, and those fatty acids come off and the glycerol separates. And that's happening in the fat cells, breaking down those triglycerides to be then used for energy. So once those fatty acids are broken off of the glycerol, like I said before, that glycerol can move on and be broken down even further and be put through almost like the carbohydrate metabolism, the pyruvate, the Krebs cycle, electron chain transport. And the fatty acids are actually broken down into these 2-carbon molecules, and it happens through a series of 4 pretty complex reactions, so it's not something I'm going to get into in this class, but all you really need to know is these long fatty acids break down into 2 carbons. So we have a cleavage every 2 carbons, like so. So you end up with something that resembles acetyl-CoA, which is derived from pyruvate. And this molecule then enters the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria to produce ATP. And depending on the size of the fatty acid will depend on how much ATP is produced. So I've drawn here just a 9-carbon one because that's all I could fit there. So you'd have each of these 2 molecules going, each of these 2 carbons going into the Krebs cycle and producing a certain amount of ATP. And so if I had a really long chain, it would produce more ATP. And if I had a shorter chain fatty acid, it would produce a smaller amount of ATP. Again, giving our bodies energy. That ATP is the energy that our cells need and our bodies need. So the next thing I want to talk about is a term called ketogenesis. And this is just a biochemical process where our bodies, particularly the liver, produce what we call ketone bodies. And ketone bodies come from the breakdown of fats, and they're produced from excess acetyl-CoA. This process supplies energy when our glucose stores are low, and it's actually how the keto diet works. So if your body does not have any or not much carbohydrate in your body, then your body's going to pull from your fat stores. And when it pulls from your fat stores, it's going to produce these ketone bodies. This process actually happens while we're sleeping too, or if you do any intermittent fasting. Your body goes into what we call ketosis, and it's because you don't have enough glucose in your body, so your body's going to pull from your fats. The fats are going to be used as fuel, and again, those things can happen if you're following the keto diet. It can also happen when you're sleeping and times of fasting. And one other thing I want to mention about the ketone bodies is that most of our organs can use these as an alternate energy source, especially our heart and our brain. Our brain will use ketone bodies when the glucose stores are low, and the reason that it will do that is because the brain does have a minimum glucose requirement. So if it's not getting that requirement met from the glucose in our body, it's going to pull from the fat stores or the ketone bodies. The heart will typically use fatty acids for energy, but it will use ketone bodies as well. So moving on to lipogenesis, this is when you have excess glucose in the body. It's kind of like, I usually use the example where the excess glucose could be coming from you enjoying too much candy from the candy bowls in class, and this ends up being stored as excess fat in your hips, your abdomen, your breasts. That's kind of where it will store. That's why those areas are where you'll notice the most maybe weight gain if you eat too much or you enjoy those candy bowls too much. So lipogenesis begins when there's excess acetyl-CoA and it overloads the Krebs cycle. So remember we said that I just can't say that word today. I don't know what's going on. Acetyl-CoA is a 2-carbon molecule. So what's happening is I have this 2-carbon molecule. Now there's lots of excess that's going to then just keep bonding to form more fatty acids. Those fatty acids then get stored in your fat cells, and most of that fat storage is going to happen in your midsection, your hips and your abdomen. And so that will continue until the fatty acid is, long enough, or however many excess acetyl-CoAs there are, it will form these long fatty acids. And again, this is either going to happen in your fat cells, or it can also happen in your liver cells, your hepatocytes, and store those excess acetyl-CoA in that way. So lipogenesis is putting back together the fatty acid, and ketogenesis is taking, lipolysis is taking apart the fatty acid. So those are how those terms work together. The last thing that I want to show you, and this is just a picture from the textbook, just kind of another little flow chart. I thought I would throw it in here so you guys had it in your notes. How fatty acids break down, how they're digested, metabolized. They can be used as energy, ATP. They also can be used to build up the cell membranes, and that would happen in the liver. And so there's many uses that the fatty acids will be used for in your body. And that's it for today's lesson. There's really no assignment to go along with this, except that you should be making sure that you're taking notes and just kind of studying over the material. There will be a review worksheet coming after we talk about protein metabolism in the next lesson. Have a great day, guys.